In the heart of Montgomery, Alabama, sits a garden district, a place where history lingers in the shades of towering oak and magnolia trees. The homes here are built to last. Broad porches, high ceilings, and woodwork that seem to echo the craftsmanship of another age. Families lived here for generations, raising children, hosting neighbors, and gathering each year for a ritual that defined the Southern life. Not every story ends with justice. Not every crime fades with time. When the world grows quiet, the shadow speaks, and we listen. This is when darkness falls. True crimes told with care and respect, and the weight it deserves. In one such home lived Brent and Charlotte Springford. To many in Montgomery, the Springfords were an embodiment of grace and stability. Brent Sr. was a successful businessman, respected for his discipline and his generosity, while Charlotte was known for her warmth, her tireless volunteer work, and her devotion to her church. They were the kind of couple people pointed to as an example, steady, defined, and kind. But behind the facade of tradition and stability, cracks had begun to form. Their only surviving son, Brent Jr., had once seemed distant to follow into their footsteps. Instead, his life became marked with inner turmoil, spiritual delusion, and alienation from the family that had given him everything. By Thanksgiving 2004, those cracks would widen into a tragedy that stunned the city and left scars that would never fully heal. In this story of the Springfords, it begins not with bloodshed, but with history, community, and the bonds of a family that, like so many others, believed that their traditions would weather any storm. Until one November night proved otherwise. Brent was a man who believed in order. His days followed a rhythm that rarely changed. An early morning walk, coffee with newspaper, and a precise schedule that carried through his work and his home life. Friends remembered him as a measured man who spoke with weight, never in haste. Charlotte, by contrast, softened those edges. She was warm, approachable, the kind of woman who knew the names of the church choir members, grandchildren, and never forgot a birthday. Together they were a couple who complemented each other perfectly. His discipline and her compassion, his structure and her spontaneity. Their daughter, Robin, grew into a steady and reliable presence, the glue who held the family together. Robin was known for her kindness, her ability to listen, and her quiet determination to maintain connections even when life pulled the family in different directions. And then there's Brent Jr. He was bright, sensitive, but troubled. From an early age, he struggled to match the expectations that was set before him. As he grew older, his search for meaning led him into paths that distanced him further and further from his parents' world. Thanksgiving Day, November 25, 2004, dawned in Montgomery like the countless others done before. The streets of the Garden District were quiet, the air carrying a crispness of late autumn. Neighbors decorated the porches with wreaths, and kitchens filled with the familiar aroma of roasted turkey, sweet potato, and pies cooling for the evening feast. For the Springfords, it was a day marked by ritual. Brent and Charlotte had always celebrated with dignity, setting their table with care, giving thanks and prayer before carving the turkey. But this year carried a subtle heaviness. Robin, as always, had checked in to wish them well, but Brent Jr. remained distant. His relationship with his parents strained into a breaking point. Though his absence had become expected, left a shadow at the table, an unspoken reminder of a family's fractures. In the evening, the Springford's home glowed with lamplights, as it had always done many times before. To a passerby, nothing seemed amiss. Inside, however, a storm was gathering, one that would erupt before the night gave way into morning. As the night settled over Montgomery, the Springford home stood in its usual quiet dignity. The streets outside were still, lit only by the porch lamps and an occasional car passing by. Inside, Brent and Charlotte went about their evening routine, unaware that the most familiar place in the world, their sanctuary, their home, was about to become a scene of nightmare. There was no sign of forced entry. The killer was not a stranger breaking through a window, but someone who crossed the threshold with purpose. What followed was swift and brutal. Charlotte and Brent were attacked with ferocity that shocked even the seasoned investigators. Their final moments, though merciful and quick, were marked by betrayal. The violence carried not only by an intruder, but by their own son, Brent Jr. Later, forensic reconstruction showed the attack was calculated, not impulsive. Brent Jr., steeped into delusional and resentment, had come to believe that his parents were obstacles to his chosen path. By the end of the night, the Springfords lay dead in their own home. Their lives ended by the child that they once cradled and nurtured. The house, once filled with warmth and tradition, fell silent. Hours passed. Outside, the world went as usual. Neighbors slept, holiday lights twinkled, and their first hint of dawn crept into the sky. Inside the Springfords' home, a stillness was almost unbearable. Family torn apart now rested in silence, their legacy hanging in the balance. It wasn't until the following day that concern started to stir. Calls went unanswered. Friends who expected to hear from Charlotte grew uneasy. By late morning, the silence had become impossible to ignore. A welfare check was requested, and the officers soon arrived at the Garden District home, unaware of what they're about to uncover. Two Montgomery officers stepped cautiously into the Springfords' residence. From the outside, nothing seemed disturbed, no broken windows, no signs of struggle, but as they moved through the rooms, their flashlights cutting through the stillness, the truth revealed itself in the bedroom. They found the bodies of Brent and Charlotte. It was a scene of violence, but also deep tragedy. These were not strangers, not victims of random crime, but respected figures in the community, cut down within their own sanctuary, their home. The officers froze, taking in the sight. Training kept them steady. With the weight of what they witnessed was undeniable. They called in the discovery, and within minutes, the quiet Garden District street filled with the sounds of sirens, radios, and hushed voices. The Springfords' home was no longer a place of warmth. It was a crime scene. When the discovery of Brent and Charlotte's bodies, the Montgomery Police Department launched a full-scale investigation. Detectives knew immediately that this was no ordinary crime. The lack of forced entry suggests that the killer had been let inside, or at the very least had access that strangers would not have. That single fact began to narrow the scope of suspicion, pointing inward rather than outward. Forensic teams scoured the scene, documented every detail. Luminol revealed the blood invisible to the naked eye, telling the story of how the attack unfolded. Fingerprint analysis began, and fibers were collected with painstaking care. Every piece of evidence was cataloged, but the question lingered: who would want to harm Brent and Charlotte? Pillars of the community. Detectives started where they always do, the family. Phone calls were traced, alibis confirmed or contradicted, and interviews conducted with relatives and close friends. It was during these interviews that cracks began to appear in the narrative. While many spoke of Springford's kindness and respectability, others hinted at deeper troubles within the family, particularly their son, Brent Jr. As the investigation continued, attention turned squarely toward Brent Jr. He had long been estranged from his parents, living a life marked by instability and mental health struggles. Friends describe him as sensitive but troubled, a man whose search for meaning. He had become entangled with a woman who encouraged his estrangement, reinforced his belief that his parents were controlling objectives. Investigators learned that Brent Jr. had recently expressed resentment toward his parents in a conversation with acquaintances. Some remembered him speaking with bitterness, even anger, about their expectations. When detectives asked about his whereabouts on Thanksgiving, his answers were vague and unconvincing. Forensic evidence would soon make his denials irrelevant. The breakthrough came through science. DNA evidence collected at the scene found in the Springford's home, combined with the absence of forced entry, the evidence formed a devastating picture that was not the work of a stranger, but of the couple's own son. Detectives confronted him with the evidence. At first, he wavered, offering half-hearted denials and evasions. But as soon as the weight of proof mounted, the reality came undeniable. By early December, police had what they needed. Brent Jr. was arrested and charged with the murders of his parents. The community, caught off guard by the news, wrestled with the contrast between Springford's image of respectability and the painful reality of the tragedy in their midst. When the case finally reached the courtroom, the city braced itself for a trial. Brent Jr. would not only seek justice for Brent and Charlotte, but also force into the open the dark truth about the family once seen as flawless. The courtroom filled with reporters, neighbors, and extended family. Each face reflected its disbelief that such a crime could come from within. The prosecution began with a sobering opening statement, laying out the facts of the case. They painted a picture of resentment turned violence, a son who had fallen under a sway of a delusion and anger, culminating in a brutal murder of his parents. The defense countered by force on Brent Jr.'s fragile mental state, arguing that he was not fully in control of his actions, that he was a young man consumed by illness rather than malice. Over the days that followed, jurors heard from detectives, forensic specialists, and acquaintances of Brent Jr. DNA evidence, a blood analysis, tied him directly to the crime scene. Experts testified about the trajectory of the attack and the signs that the victims had known their assailant. Witnesses described Brent Jr. as erratic behavior leading up to Thanksgiving, his bitterness toward his parents, and the influence of a toxic relationship that pushed him further into isolation. The defense called their own witnesses, mental health professionals who testified about his long history of depression, instability, and dependency. They argued that while he had committed the act, his mind had been compromised. Their plea was for compassion, even as evidence spoke of brutal finality. In closing arguments, the prosecution urged the jury to look at the facts. 2 lives lost, evidence overwhelming motive established. They reminded the courtroom that Brent and Charlotte had welcomed their son into the world with love, only to have their lives ended by his hands. The defense, in turn, pleaded once more for the jury to consider his illness, his vulnerability, and the possibility of mercy. The courtroom was silent as the jurors withdrew into the deliberate. Hours felt like days as the city held its breath, awaiting the outcome of a trial that had already shaken its foundations. When the jury returned, the silence was heavy, and the verdict, guilty. Brent Jr. was convicted of the murders of his parents. The weight of the word echoed through the chamber, leaving no space for relief, only sorrow. The judge, his voice steady but grave, pronounced the sentence, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. As Brent Jr. was led away, the community sat stunned. Justice had been served in the legal sense, but the deeper wound, how such a crime could emerge from within a family so respected. In the days that followed the verdict, Montgomery mourned. Churches held vigils to the same flowers at the gate of the Springford's estate, and conversations across the city circled back to the same haunting truth, that even the most admired families can conceal fractures so deep they end in tragedy. The Springfords had been a symbol of generosity and stability, and now their absence left a hollow space in Montgomery's civic heart. Local newspapers ran features not just on the crime, but on their lives that had been lost, detailing Brent and Charlotte's decades of charity work, their devotion to tradition, and their acts of kindness. The city struggled to reconcile the horror with the love of a couple had embodied. For Brent Jr., life narrowed to the walls of a prison cell. He was housed at Kelby Correctional Facility, where days became a blur of a routine. Unlike others who sought belongings among inmates, Brent Jr. retreated inward. Guards described him as quiet, withdrawn, despondent. His mental health reports noted that he spent much of his time isolated, consumed by his own thoughts. The influences and beliefs that had once fed his anger gave way to a different reality, one of regret, loneliness, and the weight of finality. While his sentence ensures he would never walk free, his inner world remains a more complex prison than any built of stone and steel. Nearly a decade later, in 2013, news broke once again. Brent Jr. had taken his own life in prison. For some, it felt like a last page of a chapter dragged on too long. For others, it opened old wounds, forcing them to revisit the grief of 2004. And their reaction was divided. Some family members and the community expressed relief that his suffering and the city's reminder of it had ended. Others, even in anger, still mourned the broken man he had become, seeing his death as a second tragedy layered upon the first. In Montgomery's, conversations about the case resurfaced, and once more, the Springford's name was spoken with mixed sorrow and disbelief. Today, the Springford's murders remain a scar on Montgomery's history. For those who knew Brent and Charlotte, the story is not of crime statistics, but of lives cut short. A couple remembered for their kindness, their tradition, and their devotion to family. Even that devotion was tested to the breaking point. The tragedy forced the city to confront difficult truths about mental illness, families' dynamics, and the dangers of leaving unspoken fracture to fester. It also reminds Montgomery of the resilience that can emerge in an aftermath of grief. Each Thanksgiving, those who knew the Springfords are reminded of the empty chairs at the table, but also the enduring importance of the compassion and vigilance. When darkness falls, stories like this reminds us how fragile the bond of family can be, and how vital it is to tend to them with care. For the Springford's family and for the city that loved them, the light of remembrance continues to shine even against the shadow of this tragedy. Well, this is it for this case, guys. Thank you for joining us tonight as we revisited this haunting story. These lives and voices deserve to be remembered. If you'd like to hear more cases told with care and compassion, don't forget to subscribe to When Darkness Falls. We care, so stay aware. The next case is already waiting in the shadows. Until then, have a good evening.